The front door of my ranch house slammed shut with a force that rattled the old windows, making the coffee cup on my table jump slightly. My name is Carl Brennan. I'm 58 years old, and I was about to discover just how little my own son thought of me. Jason stood in my living room like he owned the place, which, as it turned out, he legally did. His $1,000 boots clicked against the hardwood floors I'd installed myself 20 years ago, back when my hands were steadier and my back didn't ache quite so much. His designer suit probably cost more than most folks around Katy County make in a month, all sharp lines and expensive fabric that screamed success. "I sold the ranch," he said. Just 4 words, delivered with the same tone someone might use to announce they'd picked up groceries. 4 words that hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut, knocking the wind out of me and leaving me struggling to process what he'd just announced. I looked up from my morning paper, the crossword puzzle half finished in blue ink, still trying to make sense of what my son had just said. The sports section lay folded beneath it, coffee ring stains marking where I'd set my cup down too many times over the years. "What do you mean, sold?" Jason's jaw tightened in that way it always did when he had to explain something he considered obvious. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase, the kind of expensive case that cost more than my truck payment. The papers rustled as he dropped them onto my coffee table with a careless thud, right on top of the crossword puzzle I'd been working on. The impact scattered my reading glasses, and suddenly I felt every one of my 58 years. The deed's already transferred. Settlement was yesterday afternoon. His voice carried that same cold efficiency he used with his marketing clients, the tone that had made him successful in business but apparently had killed something human inside him. "I've prepared everything you need to know about the transition." My hands trembled as I reached for the papers, my calloused fingers struggling with the smooth legal documents. The letterhead read, "Coleman and Associates Real Estate," in bold, professional lettering. Below it, in letters that seemed to burn into my retinas, "Final Sale Agreement, Brennan Family Ranch, 500 acres, Katy County, Texas. Our address, the place where I'd raised him after his mother died. The land I'd worked for 30 years to keep in the family." "Jason, this is my ranch. You can't just—" "I can and I did," he interrupted, checking his Rolex with practiced indifference. The gold caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows I'd cleaned just that morning, before my world came crashing down. "I'm the legal owner, remember? You signed it over to me 3 years ago for tax purposes, for estate planning, you said." The memory hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I'd trusted him completely back then, believed every word when my accountant suggested the transfer would help with estate planning. Jason had promised nothing would change, sworn up and down that it was just paperwork, just a legal formality to save on taxes when I eventually passed. "Just paperwork," he'd said. "Just paperwork that was now destroying my life." "But you said—" "I said a lot of things." Jason pulled out his checkbook, the leather cover worn smooth from use, like everything else about him polished to perfection. "Look, I'm not heartless here. I'm giving you $15,000. He tore off the check with a sharp rip that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room and placed it on top of the legal documents like a tip for a waiter. I stared at that check, the pale blue paper with its neat black numbers. $15,000. For the ranch where he'd grown up, where I'd taught him to ride horses and fix fences, where I'd raised him after his mother died in that car accident when he was just 12 years old, when the world had seemed to end and we'd only had each other, where I'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities I never had, working double shifts at the oil field so he could have music lessons and sports camps and everything else that might give him a better life than mine. "There's a place I found for you," Jason continued, his tone suggesting he was doing me some tremendous favor instead of ripping my heart out. "It's a small apartment in town near the grocery store. Rent's cheap, perfect for someone in your situation. You won't have to worry about property taxes or maintenance anymore." "My situation?" The words came out as barely a whisper, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't quite name. Rage, betrayal, disbelief. They all swirled together into something that made it hard to breathe. "Come on, Dad, be realistic." Jason snapped his briefcase shut with a metallic click that sounded like a coffin closing. "You're 58 years old, barely scraping by on what's left of your oil field pension and whatever Social Security sends you. You can't maintain 500 acres anymore, Dad. Look around you." Jason gestured dismissively at the living room I'd kept immaculate for 3 decades. The barn needs a new roof. Half the fencing is falling down. The old well pump is making that grinding noise again. This way, you get a fresh start without all the burden. Burden. That word hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. This ranch wasn't a burden. It was my life's work, my legacy, the place where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories of building something meaningful with my own two hands. It's an expense you can't afford, Jason continued, straightening his tie with that same gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was lying about breaking something or skipping school. Lisa and I have been discussing this for months. We both agree it's the best solution for everyone involved. Lisa. Of course she was involved in this. My daughter-in-law had been pushing Jason to distance himself from me ever since they got married 5 years ago. I'd seen it in her eyes at every family dinner, every holiday gathering, the way she looked at everything I owned like she was already dividing it up, calculating its worth down to the penny. The calculation in her expression when she thought I wasn't looking, the subtle way she steered conversations toward my situation and how much of a worry I must be for Jason. How exactly does throwing your father out of his home benefit everyone? My voice was rising now, 30 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through the dam I'd built to keep the peace. How does stealing my ranch and handing me pocket change help anyone except you and that wife of yours? Jason's expression didn't change one bit. If anything, he seemed bored by my emotional response, like he was listening to a child throw a tantrum about bedtime. It's a business decision, Dad. Nothing personal. The ranch is worth $1.2 million according to the appraisal. After paying off your remaining mortgage and the various fees, I'm left with about $900,000. I'm giving you $15,000 of that. That's more than generous, considering. Generous. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. You're taking my home and giving me pocket change, and you call that generous? You're getting a free place to live and cash in hand, Jason said, glancing at his watch again with that same dismissive gesture that was starting to make my blood boil. Most people in your position would be grateful for such a thoughtful arrangement. Grateful. After everything I'd done for him, after working double shifts for 15 years to pay for his education at Texas A&M, after going without vacations and new trucks and decent clothes so he could have piano lessons and soccer camps and everything else he needed. After spending every penny I could spare to make sure he never wanted for anything, never had to struggle the way I had growing up poor in East Texas. I sacrificed everything for you, I said, the words exploding out of me like steam from a pressure cooker. Everything I had, everything I was. I worked myself half to death so you could have opportunities I never even dreamed of. And this is how you repay me? Jason finally showed some emotion, but it wasn't guilt or remorse. It was irritation, pure and simple. That was your choice, Dad. I never asked you to sacrifice anything. You made those decisions on your own. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. Like all those years of working 16-hour days, all those missed meals and postponed repairs to the house, all those nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table with bills spread out in front of me, like none of it had meant anything to him. Like it had all been some kind of hobby I'd taken up instead of the foundation of his entire life. Get out, I said quietly, my voice steady now with a coldness that surprised even me. Just get out of my house. Fine. Jason picked up his briefcase, completely unmoved by the finality in my voice. You have 30 days to vacate. The new owners want possession by the end of April, so you'll need to be efficient about packing. I'd suggest focusing on essentials. The apartment I found doesn't have much storage space. He paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder with the same casual indifference he might show a business acquaintance. Oh, and Dad, try to be practical about this. Fighting it won't change anything. The papers are already signed, the deed is transferred, and the money is already in my account. This is happening whether you like it or not. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone with the legal documents and that insulting check. Through the window, I watched him climb into his BMW, the engine purring to life like a satisfied cat. He didn't look back at the ranch, our ranch, as he drove down the gravel road that led back to the main highway. Didn't spare a single glance for the place where he'd learned to ride a horse, where he'd built forts in the barn, where his mother was buried under the old oak tree near the back pasture. I sank back into my chair, staring at that check in my hands. $15,000. I stared at that number until the digits started to blur together. Jason had no idea what this represented to me, no clue how deeply insulting this amount really was. See, my son thought he was dealing with Carl Brennan, the broke rancher. the simple man who drove a beat-up Ford and wore the same pair of boots for 10 years running. He had absolutely no idea about the other Carl Brennan, the one who'd been quietly building a business empire across Texas for the past 25 years while he slept. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. While Jason struggled to keep his digital marketing company afloat with bank loans and maxed-out credit cards, his poor father sat on one of the most successful car wash chains in the state. But I'd kept that secret for good reason. I wanted to see who my son really was when money wasn't part of the equation, when he had to love and respect his father for the man he was, not what he had in his bank account. Well, now I knew exactly who Jason was. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, same as it did every evening at 6 p.m. sharp. Daily revenue reports from all 25 locations. I picked it up and opened the business app that tracked every dollar flowing through my empire. Houston North, $4,200. Dallas Central, $3,900. San Antonio West, $3,750. The numbers scrolled down in neat, organized rows that told the story of a day's work across Texas. Total network revenue for today, $96,000. Not a bad Tuesday for the car wash business. Monthly projections were holding steady at $2.9 million. Annual gross revenue was approaching $35 million, and my son thought I was some desperate old man living on scraps. It had all started back in 1998, when I took my savings from 15 years in the oil fields and bought my first car wash in a rough neighborhood in Houston. Nothing fancy at all, just a small operation with 2 bays and equipment that had seen better days. But I had a vision that nobody else seemed to understand. I could see the potential in those humble little businesses that most people drove past without giving them a second thought. The oil field work had taught me about machinery, about maintenance, about the kind of attention to detail that kept expensive equipment running when it should have broken down years ago. More importantly, it had taught me about patience and persistence. When you're working a rig in the Texas heat, you learn that success comes from showing up every day and doing the work, whether you feel like it or not. I ran that first location myself on weekends while still pulling shifts on the rigs during the week. Learned every aspect of the business from the ground up. Chemical mixing ratios, equipment maintenance schedules, customer service techniques that kept people coming back. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it was mine. Over the years, I'd expanded carefully and systematically. One location became 2 when I found a struggling wash in Dallas that the owner couldn't make profitable. 2 became 5 when I discovered that most car wash operators didn't understand the fundamentals of customer flow and equipment efficiency. 5 became 10 when I realized I had a talent for picking locations that other people overlooked. Each expansion was funded entirely by profits from existing locations. I never took on investors, never borrowed beyond the initial equipment financing that I paid off within 18 months every single time. Every penny got reinvested back into the business while I continued living modestly on the ranch, driving my old truck and wearing clothes until they fell apart. By now, I owned 25 car wash locations, strategically positioned across Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and El Paso. Each one generated between $3,000 and $5,000 in daily revenue, depending on the location and the season. The math was simple but beautiful. Consistent cash flow, minimal overhead once the equipment was paid for, and a customer base that came back week after week like clockwork. Jason had no clue that his old man employed over 200 people across Texas, that his signature was on lease agreements for premium real estate in 5 major cities, that his business decisions affected the livelihoods of families from the Gulf Coast to the Mexican border. To Jason, I was just Carl Brennan, the simple rancher who couldn't afford to fix his barn roof. The beautiful part was how invisible it all was. Car washes didn't require me to dress up in expensive suits or work out of fancy offices. I could manage the entire operation from my kitchen table in jeans and a work shirt, checking daily reports on my phone while drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over the pasture. The employees knew me as Mr. Brennan, the owner who showed up occasionally to check on operations, but most of our business was conducted through my managers and regional supervisors. I'd deliberately kept my lifestyle modest, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. This ranch was where I belonged, where I felt connected to something real and lasting. The money was just numbers in accounts. The land was home. Or at least it had been, until my son decided to steal it out from under me. Now, sitting in my living room with that insulting $15,000 check in my hands, I realized it was time for Jason to get an education in exactly who his father really was. But the truth was, I hadn't been completely blindsided by Jason's betrayal. I'd known it was coming for exactly 1 week. April 8th, to be precise. That was the day I'd discovered what kind of man my son really was underneath all that expensive polish. I'd been in the kitchen that evening, cleaning up after a simple dinner of leftover pot roast and potatoes. The spring air was coming in through the open windows, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass that always reminded me why I loved this place so much. Jason had stopped by for what I'd thought was a rare social visit, settling onto the living room couch while I puttered around the kitchen, genuinely happy to have my son's company for once. That's when I heard his voice drift through the thin walls, speaking in that conspiratorial whisper people use when they think they're alone. He was on his phone, and every word carried clearly through the quiet house. "No, Lisa, he won't see it coming," Jason had said, his voice carrying a smugness that made my stomach turn. The old man's completely clueless about his own situation. Living out here like it's still 1985, driving that piece of junk truck, wearing the same clothes he's had for 20 years. I'd frozen in place, a dish towel in my hands, hardly daring to breathe as I listened to my own son discuss me like I was some kind of problem to be solved. "Getting rid of him is the smart move," Jason continued, his voice growing more animated as he warmed to his subject. "We take the ranch, set him up somewhere cheap in town, and finally stop this ridiculous burden. Dad's becoming dead weight, and it's time to cut him loose." Dead weight. The words hit me like ice water in my veins. My own son discussing my disposal like I was unwanted furniture cluttering up his life. "Trust me, he'll be grateful in the end." Jason's laugh was cold and calculating. "We frame it as helping him downsize, helping him simplify his life. Make it sound like we're doing him a favor. $15,000 should keep him quiet and grateful. That's more money than he's probably seen in years." I heard Lisa's voice through the speaker, though I couldn't make out her words clearly. Whatever she said made Jason chuckle again. "Exactly. Once we get the ranch sold and him settled in that little apartment, we can finally stop pretending to care about his financial problems. No more guilt trips about visiting more often, no more awkward dinners where he tries to give us advice about our lives." The casual cruelty in his voice was worse than any physical blow. This wasn't a business decision made in desperation. This was calculated, planned, discussed over dinner conversations with his wife, like they were deciding what color to paint their kitchen. "The buyers are eager to close," Jason said. "I told them we could have possession by the end of April. That gives us a month to get him moved out and settled somewhere that won't be our problem anymore." I'd somehow managed to make it through the rest of that evening, acting normal while Jason finished his call and spent another hour making small talk about his business and the weather. But inside, I was already planning his education in exactly who he was dealing with. That night, I'd barely slept, but by morning, I knew exactly what needed to happen. April 10th found me in Christopher Powell's law office in downtown Houston, sitting in the same leather chair where I'd planned my estate and business expansion for the past 15 years. The office smelled like old books and expensive coffee, the kind of place where serious business got conducted quietly and efficiently. "Carl, you sounded concerned on the phone," Christopher said, leaning forward across his mahogany desk. Behind him, his law degree from UT and various bar certifications hung in expensive frames. "What's going on? Is everything all right with the car wash operations?" "The business is fine," I said, pulling out the folder I'd prepared during my sleepless night. "I need to protect my assets from family interference. Someone close to me is planning to take advantage of what they think is my financial vulnerability." Christopher raised an eyebrow, but he'd been my lawyer long enough to know when not to ask for unnecessary details. "What kind of protection are you thinking about?" "Complete separation. I want my business holdings legally shielded from any claims, inheritance disputes, or power of attorney attempts." I spread the preliminary documents across his desk. "Everything needs to be bulletproof. No loopholes, no exceptions, no family override clauses." For the next 2 hours, we worked through the most comprehensive asset protection strategy Christopher had ever assembled for a client. Business ownership trusts, legal barriers preventing family members from accessing or claiming any part of my holdings, documentation that would make it impossible for Jason to touch a single penny of my empire without explicit written consent that could be revoked at any time. This creates an impenetrable wall around your primary assets, Christopher explained as he slid the final documents across his desk. Even if someone obtained power of attorney through legal trickery or family pressure, they couldn't access your car wash empire or personal holdings. Everything is locked up tight. I signed every page with steady hands, knowing I was building a fortress that would protect my life's work from the son who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. Now, on the evening of April 15th, I sat in my living room holding that insulting $15,000 check, knowing that every legal protection was in place. Jason thought he was dealing with a helpless old rancher with no resources and no options. He had no idea he'd just declared war on someone who owned a $35 million business empire and had been planning his education for exactly 1 week. The next few days crawled by like molasses in January. I went through the motions of ranch work, feeding the cattle, checking fences, maintaining equipment, all while watching Jason's confidence grow with each passing hour. He'd call every evening to check on my progress with packing, his voice dripping with false concern that made my skin crawl. "Dad, have you started looking at furniture for the apartment?" he'd ask, like he was genuinely worried about my well-being. "Remember, the place comes furnished, so you won't need much. Maybe just some personal items and clothes." "I'm working on it," I'd tell him, keeping my voice steady and defeated. Inside, I was counting down the hours until his world would start crumbling around him. 3 days after Jason's grand announcement, I had lunch with Andrew Williams, the senior loan officer at Wells Fargo, where Jason's digital marketing company had their business accounts. Andrew and I had been doing business together for 8 years through my car wash operations, and our relationship had always been built on mutual respect and trust. "Carl, good to see you," Andrew said as we settled into a corner booth at Murphy's Steakhouse, the kind of place where Houston business gets conducted over handshake deals and medium-rare ribeyes. "How are the car wash operations running? Still seeing good numbers across all locations?" "Business is strong, thank you for asking," I said, cutting into my steak. "Actually, Andrew, I wanted to discuss something sensitive with you. It's about a family matter that's affecting my confidence in someone's character and business judgment." Andrew's expression shifted to professional interest. In banking, character assessments were everything when it came to loan management and risk evaluation. "Yesterday, my son informed me that he'd sold my ranch without my knowledge or consent," I said, keeping my voice calm and factual. "He offered me $15,000 as compensation for property worth $1.2 million, explaining that someone in my financial position should be grateful for such generosity." Andrew's eyebrows rose. "He sold your ranch? Without discussing it with you first?" "Jason believes I'm a poor retiree with no assets or business connections," I continued. "He's been systematically planning to eliminate what he sees as his financial responsibility toward me. I'm concerned about what this behavior says about his character and business judgment, particularly given his borrowing relationship with your institution." I watched Andrew process this information, his banker's mind already running through the implications. "This is very concerning, Carl. Character is certainly a factor we consider in our ongoing lending relationships. I've been banking with Wells Fargo for 8 years, maintaining substantial business accounts across multiple locations, building relationships based on trust and mutual respect," I said, gesturing toward the business district visible through the restaurant window. "My son, however, appears to view family obligations as inconvenient expenses to be eliminated through deception." Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table as he considered what I'd shared. "You know, we've been monitoring some irregularities in the account you mentioned. Cash flow issues, late payments on supplier invoices, some concerning patterns in the business credit utilization. Perfect. Jason's financial troubles were worse than I'd suspected, which would make Andrew's next steps that much more decisive. "What would you recommend from a business perspective?" I asked. "If someone showed such disregard for family obligations, such willingness to deceive and manipulate those closest to them, how might that reflect on their business dealings?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, character assessments are definitely part of our risk management protocols. When borrowers demonstrate patterns of deceptive behavior or financial irresponsibility in their personal lives, it raises red flags about their business practices." "I understand completely," I said, standing up and straightening my shirt. I simply wanted to share my concerns as both a father and a long-standing client. Whatever decisions you make regarding your lending policies are entirely your professional judgment. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Carl, Andrew said, his tone taking on the formal quality that meant business decisions were being made. I'll need to review our lending policies regarding this account immediately. Standard procedure when character concerns are raised. Of course, I trust your professional judgment completely. As I shook Andrew's hand goodbye, I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Jason's business loan would be getting very close scrutiny very soon, the kind of attention that struggling businesses rarely survived. Walking back to my truck in the restaurant parking lot, I felt the first genuine satisfaction I'd experienced since this whole mess began. Jason thought he was dealing with a helpless old man who would gratefully accept whatever scraps he threw my way. Instead, he'd just declared war on someone who understood exactly how to use legitimate business relationships to achieve justice. By tomorrow, he'd receive his first lesson in the difference between Carl Brennan, the poor rancher, and Carl Brennan, the successful businessman. 3 days of careful ranch work and household maintenance filled my time nicely while I waited for the inevitable. I kept myself busy with the kind of routine tasks that had always given me peace: checking cattle, mending fence posts, cleaning equipment that didn't really need cleaning. It was meditative work, the kind that cleared your mind and helped you think through problems methodically. When Jason's Honda pulled into my driveway on Friday afternoon, I watched from my kitchen window with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player seeing his opponent make exactly the predicted move. This time, he knocked on the door instead of barging in like he owned the place. Interesting how quickly circumstances could change a man's attitude. "Dad," his voice carried none of the arrogance from our last encounter. In fact, it sounded strained, almost cracked. Can we talk? I really need to talk to you." I opened the door to find a very different man than the one who'd delivered my eviction notice just 3 days ago. Jason's usually perfect hair was disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled and had what looked like coffee stains on the front. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he raised them to knock again. "Of course, son. Come in." I stepped aside, watching him shuffle into my living room like a wounded animal seeking shelter. He collapsed onto the same couch where he'd once sat smugly explaining my disposal, but now he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. The confident businessman had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept since our last conversation. "I got a call from the bank on Tuesday," Jason said without any preamble, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Wells Fargo. They want the full loan amount immediately. All of it. $180,000. I settled into my armchair, maintaining the same calm demeanor I'd use with any visitor. That seems unusual. Banks don't typically call loans without cause. They said there were concerns about my character and business judgment. Jason's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Character concerns, Dad. They're demanding full repayment within 30 days or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings on my office building downtown." I raised my eyebrows in what I hoped looked like genuine surprise. "That does sound concerning. What kind of character issues could they be referring to?" Jason rubbed his face with both hands, and I could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. "I don't know. I mean, I've always been current on my payments. Maybe a few days late here and there, but nothing serious. The business has been struggling lately, but that's normal for small companies in this economy." He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the pasture where he'd learned to ride horses as a boy. "The expansion I told you about last year, the new equipment, the premium office space in downtown Houston, it was supposed to triple our revenue. I leveraged everything for that expansion, Dad. Everything." His words came faster now, spilling out with the desperation of a man watching his life collapse in real time. The monthly payments were manageable when clients were paying on time and new contracts were coming in regularly. But 3 major contracts fell through in February, and 2 more clients are dragging their feet on payments. I'm behind on everything: rent, equipment leases, employee salaries. Jason pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the window. "I've sold everything I could think of. The Rolex you gave me for graduation, Lisa's engagement ring, my vintage guitar collection, even traded the BMW for that used Honda out there. Raised about $30,000, but I'm still $150,000 short." The irony was absolutely exquisite. Jason had calculated my worth at $15,000 just 3 days ago, and now he needed 10 times that amount to save himself from complete financial ruin. Lisa's. Jason's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She's talking about leaving. She said she didn't sign up to be married to a failure who can't even keep a roof over their heads. She gave me until the end of the month to fix this, or she's filing for divorce and taking whatever's left of our joint accounts. I watched my son crumble before my eyes, this man who'd called me dead weight and planned my exile to budget housing. Now he was experiencing what true desperation felt like, what it meant to lose everything that mattered to you. That's unfortunate, I said simply, keeping my voice neutral and sympathetic. Jason spun around to face me, his eyes bright with unshed tears and what looked like his last thread of hope. Dad, I know I hurt you with how I handled the ranch situation. I realize now that I was insensitive about your feelings, that I should have discussed it with you first instead of just presenting it as a done deal. Insensitive. As if stealing my home and planning my exile was merely a social faux pas, a breach of etiquette rather than a fundamental betrayal of everything that should matter between a father and son. I'm asking for your help, Jason continued, desperation making his voice higher and strained. I know you don't have much, but if you could loan me whatever you can manage, anything at all, I'll pay you back with interest. I'll put it in writing, make it legal, whatever you want. I'll sign anything you need me to sign. The silence stretched between us like a vast canyon, filled with all the years of sacrifice and love and disappointment that had brought us to this moment. Jason waited, hope flickering in his expression as he searched my face for any sign of sympathy or willingness to help. Any indication that blood might still be thicker than the cruel water he'd thrown on our relationship. No, I said finally. The word came out flat and final, with no emotion attached to it whatsoever. Jason blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct rejection. No, I don't have the resources to help you with this kind of financial crisis. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my shirt with the same methodical precision I'd learned working on oil rigs. As you recently pointed out to me, I'm just a poor old rancher living on pension money and Social Security. $15,000 was more money than I'd seen in years, remember? Those were your exact words. The color drained from Jason's face as his own cruel assessment came back to haunt him. But Dad, you have to understand, Jason said, his voice breaking completely now. I'm not asking for charity here. This is a business loan between family members. I'll pay interest. I'll sign legal documents. Whatever you need. You're my father. You're the only person left who might help me. I walked toward the front door, my movement making it crystal clear that this conversation was over. You made it very clear that our relationship was a business transaction, Jason. You terminated that relationship when you sold my ranch and offered me pocket change for my cooperation. Now you'll need to find business solutions elsewhere. Dad, please. Jason followed me to the door, his composure finally cracking completely. Please, I'm begging you. I know I made mistakes with how I handled things, but you're family. Family is supposed to help each other. Family. The word tasted bitter coming from his mouth after everything he'd done. Goodbye, Jason. He stood in my doorway for a long moment, perhaps hoping I'd change my mind, perhaps finally realizing for the first time that actions have consequences. Then he walked to his modest Honda, started the engine, and drove away with the same lack of dignity that had brought him to my door. I closed the door and returned to my kitchen window, watching until his car disappeared around the corner. 2 days of seeing Jason's Honda drive past my ranch twice daily, slowing down near the driveway like he was hoping for some sign of forgiveness, convinced me it was time for the next phase of his education. The following week brought a series of carefully orchestrated business meetings that would teach Jason exactly how reputation and character affected professional opportunities. I'd spent years building relationships throughout the Houston business community through my car wash operations, and those relationships were about to serve a very specific purpose. Tuesday afternoon found me having lunch with Patricia Coleman, who ran a successful investment firm in downtown Houston. Patricia and I had done business together for 5 years when she'd helped me structure some of the financing for my car wash expansion, and she owed her initial success partly to referrals I'd provided from my business network. Carl, Wonderful to see you, Patricia said as we settled into our usual table at the River Oaks Country Club. How's the car wash business treating you? Still expanding those operations? Business is excellent, thank you. Actually, Patricia, I wanted to introduce you to someone who might be a good fit for your investment portfolio. My son Jason has a digital marketing company that's looking for capital partners. I'd arranged for Jason to join us after he thought I'd reconsidered helping him. He arrived dressed in his best remaining suit, carrying a polished presentation folder and radiating the kind of desperate confidence that comes from having no other options. Patricia, I'd like you to meet my son Jason, I said as he approached our table. He's the entrepreneur I mentioned with the marketing business. Patricia shook Jason's hand warmly, her professional demeanor impeccable. Carl speaks very highly of your business acumen, Jason. Tell me about your company and what kind of investment opportunity you're presenting. Jason launched into his pitch with practiced enthusiasm, and I had to admit he was good at it. Revenue projections, market analysis, competitive advantages, expansion strategies. He presented everything professionally and persuasively, hitting all the points that sophisticated investors wanted to hear. This sounds quite promising, Patricia said during a natural pause in his presentation. Carl, you must be proud of Jason's entrepreneurial spirit and business vision. Oh, absolutely. Jason has always been laser-focused on financial success above all else, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. In fact, Patricia, I should mention that Jason recently demonstrated remarkable business discipline. He made the difficult decision to sell his father's ranch to optimize his cash flow position. Jason's face went pale, but I continued in the same conversational tone, like I was discussing the weather. He offered me $15,000 for property worth $1.2 million, explaining that someone in my financial position should be grateful for such generosity. Quite strategic thinking, really. Maximizing asset extraction while minimizing cost exposure. Patricia's expression shifted from professional interest to concern as she processed what I'd just shared. He sold your ranch? Without discussing it with you? Jason views family relationships through a purely business lens, I explained calmly. Family obligations as burdens to be minimized, elderly parents as expensive liabilities that interfere with profit maximization. It shows a certain ruthless business mindset, doesn't it? The lunch concluded politely, but Patricia cited concerns about cultural fit and values alignment before making her excuses to leave early. No investment offer materialized, and Jason's confusion was obvious as we walked to the parking garage together. Friday brought a similar meeting with Kenneth Morrison, who owned a chain of tech consulting firms and had been looking for digital marketing partnerships. Once again, I waited for the perfect moment to share family context about Jason's character and business practices. Kenneth, you should understand that Jason has a very clear-eyed approach to cost-benefit analysis, I told him over dessert. When he determined that caring for an aging father was financially inefficient, he developed a solution to eliminate that expense entirely. Eliminate? Kenneth's eyebrows rose with obvious concern. Well, when Jason calculated that his father was becoming what he called dead weight, he arranged to relocate him to budget housing on the outskirts of town. Quite clever resource reallocation, actually. Very decisive business thinking. Kenneth declined to schedule a follow-up meeting, suddenly remembering pressing commitments that required his immediate attention. By the following Tuesday, Jason had begun to recognize the pattern developing around him. Each potential business partnership started promisingly, then deteriorated mysteriously after family context was shared. Each investor lost interest once they understood his approach to family obligations and personal relationships. "Dad, we need to talk," Jason said when he showed up at my door again, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. Suspicion mixed with growing desperation and the first hints of real anger. "Are you telling these people things specifically to sabotage my business opportunities?" I looked genuinely puzzled, like the accusation made no sense whatsoever. "I'm sharing relevant character information with potential business partners, Jason. These are relationships built on trust and mutual respect. People want to know who they're dealing with before they commit significant resources. But the way you tell it makes me sound like someone who treats family members as business expenses to be optimized." I shrugged, maintaining my innocent expression. "Jason, I'm simply describing your actual behavior in factual terms. If that creates concerns for potential partners, perhaps the issue isn't my storytelling technique." Jason stared at me, and I could see the wheels turning as the full realization began to crystallize in his mind. His father wasn't helping him network through the business community. His father was systematically destroying every opportunity, using his own reputation and relationships to ensure that Jason's business prospects died before they could even develop. The realization hit Jason like a freight train, and I watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of horrified understanding. He was beginning to grasp that his father wasn't some helpless old man to be managed and discarded. He was dealing with someone who had resources, connections, and a very long memory for betrayal. But Jason's education was far from complete. Over the next 2 weeks, his world continued to unravel in ways that went far beyond business opportunities and bank loans. I watched it all unfold with the patient satisfaction of a man who understood that justice sometimes required a steady hand and a willingness to see things through to their logical conclusion. The first domino to fall was his business partnership. Gary Hoffman, Jason's business partner for the past 4 years, called an emergency meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. I knew this because Jason had started calling me every day now, desperate and confused, looking for some explanation for why his entire life seemed to be falling apart simultaneously. "Dad, Gary terminated our partnership agreement," Jason said during one of his increasingly frantic phone calls. "He said my reputation issues were creating liability concerns for the company." "Reputation issues, Dad? What reputation issues could he be talking about?" I made appropriate, sympathetic noises while mentally noting that Gary Hoffman banked at the same Wells Fargo branch where Andrew Williams worked, and that information had a way of traveling through professional networks when character concerns were raised about shared business associates. 2 days later, Jason's assistant quit without giving the customary 2 weeks' notice. Then his accountant stopped returning calls. His biggest remaining client, a furniture chain that had been with his company for 3 years, suddenly canceled their contract, citing changes in business direction. But the social isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of Jason's education, and also the most revealing about the kind of relationships he'd built during his years of success. People he'd considered friends for over a decade suddenly became too busy to take his calls. Invitations to social events dried up overnight. The networking groups where he'd been a regular member somehow forgot to send him meeting notifications. "You know what the worst part is, Dad?" Jason said during one of his visits, slumped in my living room like a broken man. "Marcus Garcia, you remember Marcus? We've played golf every month for 5 years, been best man at each other's weddings. Yesterday I ran into him at the grocery store and he pretended not to see me. Literally turned around and walked the other way rather than acknowledge I existed." I nodded sympathetically while remembering my conversation with Marcus's uncle, who ran a successful import business and had been one of my car wash equipment suppliers for years. Word traveled fast in business communities, especially when it concerned character and reliability. "I went to Kevin Morrison's birthday party last weekend," Jason continued, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Kevin and I were roommates in college, Dad. We've been friends for 15 years. When I walked in, the entire conversation stopped. 20 people just stared at me like I was some kind of contagious disease." Jason's laugh was bitter and broken. "Kevin pulled me aside after 5 minutes and asked me to leave. Said my presence was making his other guests uncomfortable. These are people who've known me for years, who've celebrated every business success with me, who came to my wedding and toasted my happiness." The pattern was unmistakable, and I could see Jason starting to understand the difference between networking relationships and actual friendships. Most of the people in his social circle had been attracted to his success, his confidence, his apparent prosperity. None of them wanted to be associated with someone whose character was being questioned, whose business was failing, whose reputation was becoming a liability. But the final blow came from the person who should have stood by him through anything. Lisa filed for divorce on a Thursday morning, and Jason showed up at my ranch that evening looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. "She's gone," he said, collapsing onto my couch without being invited in. 22 years together, Dad. Since college, she was my best friend, my partner, my everything. And she walked away like I was a stranger she was embarrassed to have been associated with. I handed him a glass of water and listened as he described the conversation that had ended his marriage. "She said she couldn't stand being married to someone who'd lost everything because he was too proud to maintain family relationships," Jason continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "She said she'd watched me destroy my relationship with my father out of greed and selfishness, and she couldn't respect someone who would treat family that way." The irony was perfect. Lisa, who had encouraged and supported Jason's plan to steal my ranch, was now using that same betrayal as justification for abandoning him. She'd been happy to help dispose of the inconvenient father when it meant more money for them, but she had no intention of standing by Jason when the consequences of that cruelty came home to roost. She took half of what was left in our joint accounts, Jason said, staring at his hands. Said she needed to protect herself financially before I dragged her down completely. The woman I loved more than anything in the world looked at me like I was some kind of failure she was embarrassed to have been associated with. By the end of May, Jason had lost everything that had defined his identity for the past decade. His business was defunct, his marriage was over, his social circle had evaporated, and his financial situation was so desperate that he'd had to move out of his expensive downtown condo and into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of Houston. That's when he showed up at my door one final time, but I barely recognized the man standing on my porch. The confident entrepreneur was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he'd been physically beaten down by life. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his hands shook as he raised them to knock on my door. "Dad," his voice was barely a whisper. "I have nowhere else to go. I don't understand what happened to my life, but I have nowhere else to go." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't witnessed since he was a child: genuine humility. The arrogant businessman who'd stolen my ranch was gone, replaced by a broken human being who'd finally learned the difference between success and character. It was time for the final lesson in his education. I stepped aside and let Jason into my living room, watching him move like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't sit down immediately, standing instead in the middle of the room as if sitting would presume too much familiarity, too much right to comfort in the home he'd tried to steal from me. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask anything from you," he began, his voice steady but quiet, stripped of all the arrogance and entitlement that had defined our relationship for so many years. "I'm not here for money or help or business connections. I just want to apologize. Really apologize. And maybe ask if there's any way you could forgive me." I settled into my armchair but said nothing, watching him struggle with words he'd never learned how to say properly. "I've been thinking for weeks about everything I did wrong," Jason continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Not just recently, but for years. Decades even. I treated you like you owed me everything I ever received. When you sacrificed to send me to Texas A&M, I acted like you owed me that education. When you helped me start my business, I treated it like an investment I deserved rather than a gift from someone who loved me." He finally looked up at me, and I could see something I hadn't witnessed since he was a child. Genuine remorse, not the calculated apology of someone trying to manipulate a situation to his advantage. "The ranch was the worst thing I've ever done," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "You raised me in that house. You kept every detail perfect for 30 years, made it a real home, and I sold it without even asking your opinion, let alone your permission." Jason moved closer but remained standing, like a penitent seeking absolution. "I called you dead weight, Dad. I actually used those words to describe my own father, the man who worked 16-hour days so I could have music lessons and sports teams and college prep courses." His composure finally cracked completely. "You were never a burden. You were the best father anyone could ask for, and I was too selfish and arrogant to see it. I lost everything because I deserved to lose everything." Lisa left because she realized she was married to someone who could treat his own father like an inconvenience. The silence stretched between us while Jason waited, not pushing for an answer, not demanding immediate forgiveness, just hoping for the possibility that our relationship might somehow be salvaged. After a long moment, I made my decision. Justice had been served. Jason had learned the lessons that 38 years of privilege hadn't taught him. It was time for complete honesty about everything that had happened. "Jason," I said finally, "there's something you need to understand about everything that's occurred over the past month." He looked up with cautious attention, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "The bank pressure on your loan wasn't coincidental," I began. "I initiated that review through my relationship with Andrew Williams. When you sold my ranch and called me dead weight, I decided you needed to learn some difficult lessons about character and consequences." Jason's eyes widened as the implications started to sink in. You caused the loan problems?" Every business meeting I arranged was designed to fail, I continued. I shared your family behavior with potential investors specifically to destroy your networking opportunities. The social isolation you experienced was the natural result of people understanding who you really were underneath all that success. Jason stared at me, processing the magnitude of what I was telling him. You orchestrated everything, from the bank loan to the failed meetings to people avoiding me. From April 8th, when I overheard you planning my disposal, until this moment, every setback, every rejection, every loss was carefully planned to teach you what you clearly hadn't learned through 38 years of privilege and success. Jason leaned against the wall, the full realization settling over him like a heavy blanket. His father hadn't been some helpless victim of circumstances. His father had been systematically destroying his life, piece by piece, using resources and connections Jason never knew existed. But how? Jason asked. I mean, you always seemed what? Poor? Struggling? I stood up, smoothing down my shirt. Jason, would you like to take a drive with me? There's something I want to show you. 30 minutes later, Jason sat in my passenger seat as we drove toward the industrial district south of Houston. I could feel his confusion and growing curiosity as we left the familiar rural roads and entered the commercial area where my business empire was headquartered. The large blue sign came into view first. Brennan's Premium Car Wash, family owned since 1998. Jason's eyes widened as he read it, then flicked to me with the dawning realization that this wasn't some coincidence. Dad, there's someone with our last name who... No, I interrupted gently, pulling into the owner's parking space. There isn't. Anthony Rodriguez, my site manager for the past 8 years, approached my vehicle with his usual professional smile. Mr. Brennan, good to see you. Everything running smoothly today? Jason's mouth fell open as Anthony addressed me with obvious familiarity and respect, the kind of deference reserved for someone who signed the paychecks. Everything looks excellent, Anthony. This is my son, Jason. I thought I'd give him a tour of the operation. Wonderful. Your dad's built something really special here, Jason. We're processing about 600 cars daily now, and our customer satisfaction ratings are consistently above 95%. As we walked toward the facility, Jason's business mind was obviously processing the numbers. 600 cars at an average of $25 per wash meant $15,000 in daily revenue from this single location. The operation hummed with efficient precision, 12 wash bays operating simultaneously, conveyor systems moving vehicles through automated processes while teams of employees handled detailing and customer service. Electronic displays showed real-time revenue tracking, customer satisfaction scores, equipment performance metrics. This wasn't some small family business scraping by on the margins. This was a serious operation with serious money flowing through it. This is impressive, Jason managed, watching a luxury sedan emerge spotless from Bay 6. Dad, how long have you been running this place? We've been perfecting the process for 25 years, I explained calmly. Started with one location in 1998, added 2 more by 2000, then expanded systematically across Texas metropolitan areas. Jason stopped walking. Expanded to how many locations? I pulled out my phone, opening the business management app that tracked all 25 sites in real time. Revenue numbers, customer counts, operational status, everything displayed in neat columns that told the story of a day's successful business across Texas. 25 locations currently, I said, handing him the phone. From Houston to El Paso, with concentrations in every major metropolitan area. Each one generates between $3,000 and $5,000 daily, depending on location and season. Jason stared at the screen, his face pale as he scrolled through the financial summary. Daily network revenue, $96,000. Monthly totals climbing toward $3 million. Annual gross revenue approaching $35 million. Everything displayed in neat, organized columns that told the story of a business empire built over 25 years of careful planning and hard work. You own all of these? His voice was barely a whisper. Built them one at a time over 25 years, I said, retrieving my phone and closing the app with the same casual motion I'd used to check the weather. Never took investors, never borrowed beyond initial equipment financing that was paid off within 18 months per location. Jason leaned against a concrete pillar, looking like he might be sick. When I asked you for help with the $180,000, you could have written that check without thinking about it. Without thinking about it, I confirmed. I could have written 10 such checks, 20 if necessary. The silence stretched as Jason processed what he'd discovered. His father, the man he'd dismissed as a burden, the poor rancher he'd planned to warehouse in budget housing, owned a business empire worth tens of millions of dollars. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Why would I?" I asked simply. "You never asked about my work, never showed interest in my life beyond what I could provide for yours. You assumed poverty based on my appearance and used that assumption to justify treating me as an inconvenience." Jason's legs seemed to give out completely. He slid down the pillar until he was sitting on the concrete, head in his hands, trying to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. "I need to get home," he said finally. "I need to think about all of this." During the drive back to the ranch, Jason stared out the window, in complete silence, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to wake up from a dream. When I dropped him off at his modest apartment, he paused with his hand on the door handle. "Dad, There's nothing to say right now," I interrupted gently. "Go home. Think about everything you've learned today, then decide what you want to do with this information." 3 days later, Jason returned to my door, but this time he carried himself with a different kind of purpose. Not the desperate supplicant from previous weeks, but someone who'd done some serious soul-searching and reached important conclusions about his life. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask for anything," he began, "but I was wondering if you might have any work available. Anything at all. I don't care what it is or how much it pays. I need to learn how to work honestly, how to earn respect instead of expecting it." I studied his face, looking for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. All I saw was a man who'd finally learned the difference between taking and earning, between entitlement and gratitude. "I'm going to offer you something," I said. "Not charity, not a handout, but an opportunity to prove you've actually changed." Jason's eyes lit up with cautious hope. "I need someone at the Houston North location for basic maintenance and cleaning. $18 per hour, full 8-hour days. You'll work under Anthony, taking instructions from employees who know the business better than you do." "I'll take it," Jason said immediately, without negotiating or asking for details. "1-week trial," I continued. "If you prove you can handle honest work with the right attitude, we'll discuss whether this arrangement continues long-term." That first week was brutal for Jason. He struggled with industrial vacuum systems, fumbled with chemical mixing ratios, and moved with the inefficiency of someone completely unaccustomed to manual labor. By lunch the first day, his polo shirt was soaked with sweat and spotted with cleaning solution stains. But he didn't complain, not once. When a customer complained about water spots on their luxury truck, Jason apologized professionally and personally redetailed the affected areas without being asked. When Maria, one of our detail specialists, showed him proper technique for applying protectant solution, he listened respectfully and practiced until he got it right. "Your hands are soft," Maria observed during the afternoon break. "You've never done this kind of work before, have you?" "No, I haven't," Jason admitted without embarrassment. "I need to learn. Could you show me the proper way to handle the tire shine applicators?" By Friday, Jason had transformed from struggling amateur to competent team member. His hands were calloused, his movements efficient, his attitude consistently professional. More importantly, he showed genuine respect for the work and the people who did it daily. "Thank you for this week," he said simply as we finished closing Friday evening. "I learned more than just car care techniques. I watched my son secure equipment and check supply levels with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to business spreadsheets. The arrogant executive was gone, replaced by someone who understood the dignity of honest work." Sunday afternoon, I made my final decision. "There's something important we need to discuss," I said as Jason organized the supply room. "I've asked Christopher Powell to meet us at his office tomorrow. There are some family business matters to resolve." At Christopher's office Monday morning, I began with complete transparency about everything that had happened. "Before we address legal matters," I said, "Jason needs to understand that justice has been served, and it's time for a new chapter in our relationship." Christopher pushed a folder across his desk. Jason opened it to find partnership documents outlining gradual ownership transfer of the car wash operations over the next 5 years, based on performance and character demonstration. "You'll start as operations manager for the Houston region," I explained. 8 locations generating approximately $3 million annually. If you prove you can handle responsibility with the same integrity you showed this week, we'll expand your role gradually." Jason's voice broke as he read through the documents. "This is more than I deserve. It's exactly what you deserve now that you understand the difference between taking and earning," I said, standing and extending my hand. "Welcome to the family business, partner." Jason rose and clasped my hand, then pulled me into the first genuine embrace we'd shared in decades. "Thank you for loving me enough to teach me these lessons, even when I didn't want to learn them. Thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be." As Jason signed the partnership agreements, I felt the deep satisfaction of perfect justice achieved through love rather than revenge. The arrogant son who'd stolen my ranch was gone forever, replaced by a man worthy of the Brennan family name. That $15,000 check still sits in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as proof that even the most broken relationships can be rebuilt when both people are willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and change. Jason earned his place in our family business one clean car at a time, and that's worth more than all the money in Texas. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all, but the character to handle it properly.